The growing wealth gap in Australia is quickly becoming a massive problem. The spread of wealth has done a total 180 since the 1950s and 1960s, and we know that's continuing. In 2021, the top 10% owned 46% of the wealth. The next 30% owned 38% of the wealth, leaving the remaining 60% with just 17% of the wealth. This channel published a video earlier in the year with the claim that Australia has been bought. The TLDR here is that Australia is a corpocracy. In this video right now, I intended to make the claim that the people who have the highest stakes in these corporations are the ones who are getting wealthier because wealthy people own more shares in these corporations than poor people do. I wanted to look at questions like, is having the wealth distributed in this way helpful to society? Is trickle-down economics just a fancy term made up by politicians, corporations, and industry bodies? And if the wealth effect is a problem, is this just a social justice issue? As I started creating this video, what I discovered was that maybe we're just following the UK, and for us to look ahead, then maybe we should just look there. Large wealth gaps have existed before. In fact, Australia is relatively equal when you compare it to most examples of bad wealth gaps throughout history. As a nation, Australia was colonised by convicts, many of them victims of wealth gaps. We grew up hearing stories of 18th century parents getting thrown into overcrowded prisons just for the crime of trying to steal a loaf of bread to feed their starving families. The UK is a great study to follow for wealth gaps because our history is so intertwined. After all, it's where modern day Australia originated. Let's look at post-World War II. It's the late 1940s. Britain had a massive post-war debt of 200% of GDP and had to turn to austerity, which is arguably one of the worst things you can do to solve their debt problems. At this time, the austerity was dealt out relatively evenly. The top income tax bracket was 90%, and the government spent all this additional money on social policies like the National Health Service, housing and education. Then the period came from 1970 where the wealth gap started to divide again. Australia should pay particularly close attention to the British scenario because it feels similar but a decade or two earlier. Let's look at Britain throughout this time. Privatisation of industry, deregulation of finance, tax cuts for the rich went from 83% to 40% from the late 70s to the early 90s. Tightening of welfare benefits also happened in this time frame. Australia followed a very similar path, which I'm going to explain in a bit, but if Britain had similarities in its society that led Australia's by a decade or two, then it would make sense to look at Britain today and get some glimpse of where Australia might be headed. But first, let's look at how Australia followed Britain. Privatisations. Australia followed in the 90s. Commonwealth Bank, Qantas, Telstra, they're all great examples of this. States like Victoria, which once again had a massive debt problem, privatised things like electricity and public transport. Deregulation of finance. In the 1980s, Australia floated the Australian dollar, which allowed the market to determine the value of the dollar. There was also banking deregulation, which allowed in foreign banks and competition. And in 1992, compulsory super was introduced. Tax cuts for the wealthy. In 1996, Keating cut the top marginal rate from 60% to 49%, and that continued under the Howard government. The 50% capital gains tax concession is one of the notable examples of tax cuts for the wealthy. Reduced welfare. The Howard government focused on reducing welfare. The most memorable policy they wanted to introduce was the Work for the Dole scheme. Let's look at current day Britain. The concentration of wealth. Based on 2021 data, the top 10% of the UK population owned about 57% of the wealth, which was an increase from 52.5% in 1995. We can see by this data that the wealth gap continues. The next census in Australia is due in August this year, so we don't know what happened in the post-COVID, post-stimulus era. We have plenty of indications, however, that we will see this wealth gap continue on its trend. Britain also has a housing crisis, something so bad the poor are waiting 55 years for public housing. The rental market has been described as being at boiling point, and house prices are still going up despite massive unaffordability. All of this sounds all too familiar. I'm going to give my opinion in a bit, but first I'd like to hear what other people think about this, because I'm no expert here. This channel isn't necessarily about trying to be right 100% of the time, but more about learning and trying to navigate these difficult times. From a financial point of view, the purpose of my business is to help people make it financially, and I think a key to that is having a narrative of what is happening so you can position yourself in the best position for you. If you'd like to support the channel and you need help with a home loan, then please book a time to have a chat with me. Link will be in the description. If the UK is leading the Australian wealth gap, then it paints a pretty gloomy picture. Middle income people now find it harder to buy assets because the cost of everything has gone up, whilst the list of people considered poor continues to grow. This leaves less buyers in the markets to compete against wealthy buyers who will continue to buy assets because their assets and income have inflated. Personally, for me, I don't think much will change until the world changes. I'm not sure if this is my perception, but it feels as if we're headed towards the world changing. Whether it changes for good or for worse, time will tell.